Yes, and welcome to the Green Justice Podcast, Season 2. My name is Mark Vardy.
And I'm Greg Simmons. And today we're very excited to be joined by Conrad King, who is faculty in the Political Science Department here at KPU and has an interest in mobilities and flows of people and policies in particular, with a particular focus on the EU. That's his area of expertise. But I think we're going to be talking in a wide-ranging manner today about transborder issues in relation to migration and security and ecological issues.
All kinds of things. Everything is on the table.
So welcome, Conrad.
Greg, Mark, thank you. It's a pleasure to be here. Yeah, varied interests in all things political, of course, but also particular acute interests over the last few years has been around kind of what one might term transborder mobilities. In the 1990s, probably would have been referred to as globalization, not well defined at the time and probably still not that well defined. But one of the effects of globalization is this idea of flows of people, of goods, services, policy learning, the ideologies sometimes, populist ideologies flowing across borders and this kind of transborder mobility of stuff, of things. And my personal interest in this as a political scientist is the governance of these aspects, because we can think of governance and politics as typically pertaining to nation states. Nation states have various forms of government, sometimes federal forms, and as well as also parliamentary versus presidential. And it has a clear kind of idea of a government that has a hierarchical, sometimes coercive power over citizens, the power to make policies that are binding on the citizens in that geographical area. The phenomenon that I'm interested in transcends those areas. So nation states can be responsive to it. They create public policy in order to respond to the challenges and demands of transborder mobilities. But there's also international organizations and other kinds of actors, including non-state actors, that can govern these transborder mobility aspects. So I know we could look at something. A straightforward example might be a free trade agreement, such as one that's between Canada, the US, and Mexico. Here we have an international agreement that governs what kind of things have tariffs, how customs work. And then it also has side agreements on like labor standards, environmental standards, relatively weak side agreements, I should note. It's really fundamentally about trade. But that's the type of governance mechanisms we would see to try and govern these transborder mobilities, what's permitted, what's incentivized. And the challenge about some of these transborder mobilities is that there is no clear hierarchical government to oversee them. As an international agreement, it means that there's a kind of, sometimes established a kind of governance mechanism that oversees them. But the challenge with these governance mechanisms that are transborder in nature, except in a few exceptional cases like the European Union, there's a significant democratic deficit in the overseeing of them. So take NAFTA, for example, the original NAFTA and the more recent NAFTA 2.0 in Canada, we call it the CUSMA agreement, Canada, US, Mexico agreement. The citizens of Canada did not have much input into this renegotiation, could not hold to some degree through national elections, we can hold people accountable, but we also have a kind of acquiescence to the leaders of our countries in that they have the latitude to make these agreements without specific input from citizens or civil society groups. And this, in spite of sometimes some significant resistance from civil society. We can look back at the history with NAFTA and the more recent agreement, trade unions, environmental groups having significant resistance and negative things to say about it, not wanting these types of agreements, and yet they went through despite that. So the politics side of things is probably what interests me the most, is the governance, the politics, and this kind of, can we create a kind of global public policy, or are we still stuck in this realm of national public policies as a response to these international flows?
Right.
And there's so many issues that kind of require a globalized response. Environmental issues, climate change, like there's all of these aspects that kind of quite famously escape the bounds of the nation state. So is that something that you look at in terms of like how do these individualized, compartmentalized nation states respond to an issue that is larger than they are?
Yeah, it's something we might call problems without passports. Taking climate change or any kind, most environmental concerns that we would have typically don't respect national borders. And simple ones from the 1980s, like the acid rain agreement that was agreed to between the U.S. and Canada, at least a recognition that this was a thing. This was something that needed to be managed, and it couldn't be managed solely by one political jurisdiction. It needed to have some kind of transborder public policy to manage that kind of situation. And there's some success, moderate success. I mean, there's some evidence that it perhaps didn't have as much impact as one would have hoped, but at least the attempt to deal with this particular issue is evidence that there is political will to have a kind of transborder public policy, but that's always in tension with the desire for kind of national sovereignty, to not restrict one's autonomy as a country, as these national leaders don't want to restrict their autonomy as a country to act freely and independently and make the policies that they want to make for what they perceive as their citizens. So we don't have a world government that can enforce or implement these kinds of agreements, these types of transborder global public policies. And so we're always kind of facing that impediment. But beyond that, there's a kind of paradox that we have these collective action dilemmas that are global in scope, or at least regional in scope, transborder in scope. And we don't have a kind of collective action solutions that match that level of problems without passports. Just to take a brief example, I think that you're very much interested in, Mark, is like looking at climate change policy. People think of the Paris Agreement as being a kind of transborder public policy. And in a sense, it's not. It's an intergovernmental public policy where they came to an agreement in 2015. Most countries in the world were signatories to it. But ultimately, though the ambitious goals, or somewhat ambitious goals, depending on 1.5 or 2.0, et cetera, the somewhat ambitious goals that were set, are they're pledges made by a national government who can then not fulfill the pledge. There's a naming and shaming aspect if they don't, but there's no enforcement mechanisms. Governments can switch, as we saw with the Trump administration in 2016, who essentially decided to ignore that agreement for that 4-year term that Trump was president. So as we can see, it's still a relatively weak kind of global public policy to deal with these kinds of issues.
Yeah, and there's this governance mismatch, really. And what we do have is really at the level of treaty. But there's also differences in how treaties are regarded, like the Paris Agreement, other types, typically environmental treaties, tend to not have a lot of like enforcement mechanisms, right? So they're instantiated through the individual member governments. And some of them do, though, like NAFTA, especially the original NAFTA, had these mechanisms that when you talk about the democracy deficit that you mentioned at the beginning, it made me think of Chapter 11 and these various mechanisms that individual, basically corporations, could use to override government action, to the extent that the government, at least on a local level, does represent the people, does have that at least capacity for democratic representation. You have this kind of institutionalized system where you have these boards composed of trade lawyers that they have the power of courts, but they don't have the accountability of courts, that are able to make these decisions and say that, no, you can't, in fact, have this environmental policy because it's seen as a discriminatory trade practice. Now, I think actually some of that is better in actually the new NAFTA. But it still goes to this bigger point of like what you might call like global political economy and the power of, is it really a form of kind of privatized governance to an extent, in that you have these powerful private actors who are able to kind of override even democratic will? I'm wondering what you think about that kind of take.
Yeah, I mean, certainly, taking concrete examples like the Chapter 11, the dispute settlement mechanism in the original NAFTA deal, in which you had private actors, private entities, multinational corporations, capable of kind of a judiciary system that it could take governments to court, and that was removed from the latest Kuzma deal in 2020. But they still have a high commission, a kind of high free trade commission that operates. But these are state actors now, yet still largely unaccountable to the general public. So I think it's difficult to know the motives of trade ministers and commissioners who are negotiating these deals. But I wonder if part of the motives for changing this dispute settlement mechanisms from one free trade agreement to another was less about disabling private multinational corporations and other types of private actors from being able to bring governments to court, and just reinstating the power of the state, yet still a relatively unaccountable part of the state, as the actors that get to make the decisions. So I guess what I'm meaning by that is I don't know if the democratic deficit has been bridged by removing private actors. Rather, one of the reasons that NAFTA became possible in the early 1990s was the growth of neoliberal ideas and the idea of free markets and free trade, etc. It was the zeitgeist of the time, so that you had all the national actors in Mexico, Canada, the U.S., but also in other regions of the world, all kind of reading out of a neoliberal playbook and thinking that markets should dominate. But one of the critical aspects of neoliberalism isn't merely that there should be free markets and private actors, but that the state is going to enable that, and the state's going to create the structure whereby free markets are dominant and economies are deregulated. So the state plays a critical role in neoliberalism.
Right. I think that's a really good point. But sorry, go on.
And in that sense, I wonder if the latest iterations of free trade deals, such as Kuzma, is just reinforcing the idea of the state reinforcing not our rights as citizens and civil society groups that might have an idea of the state supposed to protect the public good, which is one conception of what the state should be doing and what we would hope they do, and we might hold them accountable at election time, but rather that the state is trying to reinforce a kind of playbook for neoliberal market-oriented ideas.
Right.
So in that sense, it seems like an improvement. Perhaps arguably it is, because you're probably not going to have the same kind of Chapter 11 dispute settlements that we saw emerge out of NAFTA. But we are still, I don't necessarily think that we've turned a wheel towards the states now seeing the public good as their prime raison d'etre. I still question that. It's to be determined. It's a fairly new agreement, so its implementation we have to keep an eye on.
Right. But your point about neoliberalism, I think, is an interesting one, because it is often presented ideologically, I think, as let the free market reign,
remove the public state.
But I think you're right. It's not, and it never was. That's why it's not just classical liberalism, right? It's neoliberalism. The people, who was it, the Montpellier Society folks who advocated for this neoliberalism were themselves quite, as far as I understand it anyway, quite clear that we need to have the state enforce the conditions in which business will thrive. So
it also created, and the interesting about neoliberalism as well, which differs from classic liberalism, but is pertinent for kind of our conversation about the kind of creation of not just governance, but the creation of a kind of civil society, is it actually is a moral playbook beyond classic liberalism. Essentially had nothing fundamental to say about the good. They were saying essentially it's all about negative liberty. Don't interfere with people's choices, whatever their choices, whatever they're as citizens or corporations or what have you, in the private sphere, in the civil society sphere, whatever those choices are, people should be free to do those things that make them happy. The pursuit of happiness, life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness.
Right.
Without having any sensibility about what is appropriate, what should happiness be about. I think neoliberalism goes beyond that and suggests that we want that kind of negative freedom, the freedom to be uninterfered with. Certainly, that's a key part of neoliberalism. But I think it's also making a statement about what is good, what is in the common good. And in a sense, negative liberties and markets are a kind of, it's in a sense, it's kind of the market mechanism is an appropriate way of guiding behavior. It's a
Right.
kind of an ethic, not just negative liberty, but a whole ethic of saying, well, we can know the right way to have it, the common good, and we can know the right way to act as individuals or private actors in civil society by using a kind of market fundamentalist ethic to the way that we govern ourselves. So I think neoliberalism is a bit more nefarious, if you will, or pernicious, or I'm not sure what's,
Or openly ideological. I mean, I get
or more ideological, because it's I think it does make claims about what is the good, as in a way that classic liberalism I don't think tried to.
because you can think of, one thing I looked at years ago in my master's was electricity deregulation, and how a move to a market system actually involves much more regulation than a classic kind of public utility or even a private utility that's regulated, where it's like a single provider. And that's just one example of how the government's actually being more active under a neoliberal framework. But if the government comes in and says, okay, we're going to nationalize this utility and just have it a single operator, have it publicly owned, that is seen as bad, right? That is seen under a neoliberal framework as unwarranted government interference in the market, whereas the first is seen as the market itself. But I mean, I would say that there is no free market, right? There is no market that exists independently of a structural framework of some kind. So it's kind of like labeling, it's kind of shifting things in one direction and labeling that the free market or whatever. But sorry, Mark.
I've got a question. I've got a question about neoliberalism.
Yes.
Because it's a super interesting concept to have, like, what does neoliberalism add to the negative liberties that you're describing earlier of liberalism traditionally thought? So where does complexity and uncertainty fit into that? Because I'm thinking, and I don't know, but I'm thinking of like the influence of like the economist, Schumpeter, I guess his name was, and Hayek, and this kind of idea that the free market responds as a natural organism, right? So they've got like this concept of the forest fire, this process of creative destruction. And so instead of the state trying to like ossify entities, the state should be permitting the destruction of, and they scale it from like empires all the way down to individual corporations, so that something new can be born out of the ashes, kind of thing. And there's a really, I think, a interesting shift with that towards thinking around like the governance of complexity in a way. And I'm just wondering if that is part of this move to neoliberalism that you're.
Yeah, I mean, one of the ways that I think you would see this kind of a shift towards a neoliberal thinking that manages uncertainty and complexity is by creating insurance markets. Insurance by its nature means to underwrite uncertainty and to be able to quantify it and then put a market value on it. So in that sense, any neoliberalism probably would make the move of actually being able to create a cost or a price point for any given good in society, including the certainty or an insurance good, if you will. So having robust insurance markets is something that I think would emerge from neoliberalism. The question then becomes is what kinds of insurance should be private and competitive, and what kinds of insurance schemes should be public, underwritten by the public sector. And the debate in British Columbia that's been this past election as well, and in BC politics has always been around like car insurance, where we've got lesson drawing from other provinces. Should we have a private car insurance scheme or a public car insurance scheme? But I think those aren't the best lessons necessarily in terms of car insurance as being something that could be better managed by the state or better managed by private entities. We can see evidence that maybe both has a possible, and depends on what you want out of that insurance scheme: cheap insurance or insufficient kind of liability coverage, etc. I think it gets more difficult when you try to have insurance schemes like health insurance schemes, where the type of goods that people want are difficult to put price points and values on, like good health.
Yeah.
So in that respect, I think that the neoliberal approach to insurance is everything is insurable by private competitive insurance companies, and that the only role for the meaningful, robust role for the state is merely to regulate the insurers to the point where they're not being criminal in their, like, not paying out insurance payments, etc. And that is it. Otherwise, 1,000 flowers bloom, and if you insurance company should be able to insure just about anything, which to me is a bit of a terrifying idea.
Well, especially with
Yeah.
like I'm again thinking of climate change and like the material impacts of it, right? And like whether, I mean, obviously wildfires are, but then also increasing storm surges, right? And like, so there's coastal areas to think about, like what's happening in coastal areas of Florida, for example, where insurance companies, I think, this is not my area of expertise, but I think that they are looking at, what is being predicted for these areas of the coast over the upcoming decades. And they're like, is this something that we still want to be in the business of, insuring these coastal properties, right? Yeah. So I think it's a vastly interesting question, because they also get into, like, what is it, the reinsurance industry.
Right.
And so it's not just like the insurance companies, but then also like, well, who is actually insuring the insurance companies, and how does climate change, affect their calculations of who they're going to insure?
But I mean, climate change and the effects of climate change, I think, are a great example. The limits of private insurance, or demonstrate some of the limits of private insurance schemes. And one can think of, the responses of insurance companies to, rising sea levels and degraded ecosystems, and what that might cost businesses and families on their family insurance, is a way to kind of measure, to put a price point on climate change. And I think it's probably a necessary aspect of understanding climate change, because it's almost speaking the language of existing economists, existing neoclassical economists, but also existing kind of neoliberal thought. Is at least you're meeting them where they are in terms of the way that they conceive of how to manage climate change. And that it's one of the advantages, we should make a quick distinction between, I'm going to come back to this point about insurance, the limits of insurance schemes for climate change, but we should make a distinction between capitalism and neoliberal capitalism. I mean, capitalism has demonstrated itself to be one of the most kind of productive economic systems in the history of mankind for things like innovation, Schumpeter's creative destruction, for things like high levels of individual productivity. So there's definitely advantages to capitalism that have been demonstrated over the last few hundred years. But there's certainly also disadvantages, boom-bust cycles and things like this. It suggests that capitalism as an economic system probably works better for even human flourishing than centrally planned economies. However, unmanaged capitalism seems to be actually not good for human flourishing as well. So there might be a balance to be struck there. So green capitalism is a way, to and not necessarily greenwashing, but a legitimate kind of green capitalism that looks for innovation, some technological, but also adaptation measures, et cetera, to manage the kind of worst effects of climate change. I think capitalism is a vehicle towards that, possibly not by itself, but it's a vehicle towards that. Now, within this capitalist system, we have this idea of, having, like, one of the largest manifestations of it is these insurance schemes that will insure against climate change effects around the globe, and they'll put a price point on it. But I imagine that most people who have some kind of green ideology embedded in their thinking would not suggest or believe that the way that we can measure the value of our natural or even built environment is solely by the cost it is to replace. So there are certain aspects of this natural environment and even human built environment that suggest that there's things that are not costs that you can't put price points on. Beauty, for example.
Yeah, right. Yeah, I think that that you really saw that debate around, like, the Millennium Ecosystem Assessment, and what is it? They're got the 4 ways of measuring ecosystem services. That's
Oh, right.
like
Yeah.
like thinking about valuing nature through the services that it provides us. And there's a whole kind of rubric and way of trying to do exactly what you're saying, put a value on
Yeah.
nature, including the cultural services, right? So they've got like this, and that with huge resistance, because for a lot of people that was like, you can't value the intrinsic worth that nature has for us in a spiritual or sense
Yeah. You
through
can't
this
come on.
economic kind of regime, which I think is maybe what you're talking
Yeah,
about.
exactly.
Yeah. Yeah. That kind of, yeah. Okay. So we're ranging widely. I like it.
Welcome to
though.
the Green
Yeah.
Justice
I was gonna
Podcast.
say, yeah. Yes, we are ostensibly about green justice, being ecological, environmental, climate justice. How does all this relate perhaps to notions of justice? How does it, we originally started off talking about mobilities, right? And democracy, democratic input over those mobilities. What are the implications for that in terms of addressing these crises that we face? The climate crisis, biodiversity crisis, and so on. I
Well-
know that's a massive question.
Yeah, I'll add another dimension to it as well, and that's human crises. I think that, certainly some of the biodiversity, there's numerous crises that are produced because of climate change and our lack of a willingness to tackle this. But one of the things that I look at in terms of the kind of a mobilities paradigm is also humans moving, climate change refugees amongst them. And it's deeply concerning that we seem to, not we, but many national governments no longer conceive the movements of people, particularly those seeking asylum from climate change effects, as being a justice issue or even a human rights issue.
Yeah.
It's a security issue now. And so that is something that's deeply concerning, because not only does it flip the kind of sensibility around what a human is worth, to put value on a human and their kind of intrinsic value and their suffering is something that needs to be observed, that these individuals deserve justice that they're not receiving in their home environment or in their home nation, and making it about this kind of securitization of borders and securitization of migration, undocumented and documented migrants. And I find this kind of deeply troubling, not only because of the way it's been reframed, but also because the type of reframing that it allows is relatively opaque, for the very reasons I mentioned about transborder mobilities.
Right.
These are not citizens of Canada. Let's use Canada as an example. People that might come to Canada as climate refugees or even political refugees, asylum seekers. These are not Canadian citizens. So we, as a society and our state representatives, owe them nothing, in a sense. That's the sensibility.
Right.
We don't owe them justice because they are not citizens of our country. They're not tax-paying contributors. They're not voting responsible, jury-serving citizens, and therefore they're outside the fold of even our Charter of Rights and Freedoms. We extend this hospitality, I guess, of having a Charter of Rights and Freedoms. We typically extend that to even temporary residents, but we're not obliged to if they become security threats. So the whole changing of that frame does two things. It changes the way that we think about humans and other species as well, perhaps, but it also changes what we can do about it as maybe even concerned Canadian citizens, when the only recourse we have is to maybe try to hold our provincial and national governments somewhat accountable once every 4 years in an election. And then they go and they can make agreements and public policies that with other actors, other non-state and international actors, that we don't have much democratic input.
Right. So the kind of centering on the nation state, I think it's kind of analogous to the failure to deal with global ecological problems. Like we have these massive global system problems, be they environmental, we try to, but we only view them through the lens of the nation state. Same when we look at these social problems, right? It's actually an integrated global system, but we view it just locally through our own national lens. And we fail to see our own role, right? A lot of the the West, Canada included, has been involved in destabilizing places from which people come, and that there's a causal, there's a context and a causality there that just gets negated. I think a lot of times, so we fail to see the bigger picture, right?
And it's tricky. How do we take responsibility as civil society, as just citizens without, we're relatively politically unequal compared to national and provincial leaders. But how do we take responsibility for things like justice for people from other places? How is that possible? I don't have an easy answer for this, but it gives us a profound challenge. And at least in the kind of political world, but perhaps the beginning of being able to rise up to that challenge is thinking, is our ideas, and to be able to think beyond this kind of narrow national scope, and thinking about kind of a global citizenship, if you will. So,
yes, yeah.
Yeah, there's something really interesting in this about thinking about like borders, because typically, I think, I'm curious to hear your thoughts on this. Borders are often in sort of a public kind of consciousness in areas thought of as fixed. And so fixed or impermeable or stationary, or having a kind of like a permanence in space and time kind of thing. Like that's the ideology, if you will, of the border. And then, but you're also interested in mobilities, right? And these flows that, bump up against the border. And so there's something about the nation state itself as a political form, right? That has a history, it's a particular genealogy, and I'm just wondering if some of the ways of thinking around these complex environmental problems that Greg was talking about that exceed the fixity of the border, requires us to be thinking about, well, what does or what could come next, right? Like, is there a way of thinking beyond the nation state, I guess, is one question.
I think that there is. I mean, the two great political hopes, if you will, in thinking beyond the nation state that seem to have emerged only in the last, in the late 20th century or second half of the 20th century and early 21st century. I say that the two that seem to emerge, and they've both been disappointing for various reasons, but still retain possibility. One is the European Union. And I know it well from my own research, my own studies, etc. So I'm kind of well versed in how the European Union works and how it doesn't work. I mean, it certainly has its drawbacks, but it's in one respect it has transcended the idea of the nation state and the fixity of borders, in that there's the free mobility of people, of goods, and also that there's a direct effect of a regional entity to manage globalization effects, including climate change effects, and manage it in a binding way, in a way that they can compel the member states of the European Union to enact European-level public policies. So, and that could cut both ways. I mean, the European Union is also, for periods of time, has been seen as like a neoliberal project, in the 1990s in particular. So it can go whatever direction is seen as, but it's transborder. Whatever direction it goes, whatever outcomes it achieves. And generally speaking, it gets kind of a bad rap for being inactive in crisis, but it's deliberately built to be a big, slow-moving institution that's going to make decisions slowly, but hopefully it's going to make, legitimate decisions. Its outputs are going to be legitimate with a great deal of input legitimacy as well, or as much as they can afford. So it has democratic mechanisms to ensure that they're held accountable to various member states, but also directly to the citizens of member states, the European Parliament. So I think there has been some hope that these kind of regional blocs, these regional actors like the EU, might be a way forward of dealing with problems without passports. And they, to differing degrees, depending on the kind of the policy challenge or the environmental challenge, they've had a differing degree of success dealing with this. But certainly, I would argue that the European Union generally has had more success dealing with problems without passports than other political containers, other entities like a single nation state like Canada. So in that respect, that was one thing that people still have hope for, and it's proving itself to be moderately successful in, for example, enabling if they failed in 2009 with the Copenhagen meeting of the Conference of the Parties of not really being able to guide the agenda, they certainly succeeded in 2015. Now, the Paris Agreement might not be the greatest agreement for climate change ever, but it is shepherded through by the European Union in a way that at least we have that agreement. So in that respect, their multilateral approach, their transborder kind of ethic and perspective, I think did facilitate an ability to at least get the Paris Agreement in 2015 as one example. But there's plenty of other examples how the EU has been capable of being transnational in perspective and transnational in scope. And another possibility, which I wonder now if it's perhaps failed, but I can recall reading a pretty interesting book in the 1990s about the whole great hope of the internet being this wonderful, transborder democratic force for good. And I don't know if that worked out.
Well,
So
if the Green Justice podcast can have any influence on it, people can be listening to this wherever they have an internet connection. And yeah, we're a
Right.
force for social good here. So like, just
The cutting edge of global change.
yeah, I do remember that the early days of the internet, right? Where it was
possibilities,
just like
yeah.
the reimagining civic society in all kinds of ways.
I-
for sure.
Yeah, there was that hope, right? But this is often the case with new technology. The people said the same thing about television, right? That it was going to transform society. But the problem is it becomes commercialized. Like it goes back to the capitalism aspect again, arguably, like being ultimately a commercial entity and controlled really by private actors. I mean, it's only because of that public involvement, right? That it was originally set up by the military
Mhm.
that it even exists at all. But I don't know. Maybe there's still hope for the internet.
You think about it as a mechanism for governance. I mean, one of the challenges we see now, I guess, with the internet, particularly, so even relatively, I mean, prior to the internet, the television era of being this medium of communications technology where you communicate with many, but it was still elite to many
yeah.
communication. And what we've seen with the internet, particularly with social media, is many to many communication. What we probably did not fully account for in these kind of hopeful views of what the internet would become was how the governance mechanisms of the internet were right for the highest bidder in a sense, and you get monopolies of informational monopolies by Google, etc.
Yeah.
So now we're in a situation where not only do we have that entrenched and safeguarded into the internet that these large corporations have a lot more governance power than we do as individual citizens or as podcast makers, but beyond that, we now have non-human entities. It was always a problem of anonymity on the internet, people being able to say whatever they like without taking kind of personal responsibility for those statements. And now we have things saying what they like without taking personal responsibility, and AIs and bots and things like that. So we're in a whole round where and more or less, I don't want to be too pessimistic, but I've given up hope on the internet being a great democratic governance mechanism for the future. I can't see it.
Yeah.
I think the omelet cannot be unmade. and so I wonder if that offers hope for the future as well. So I guess I return to a kind of like one of the nice things about the European Union as well is it's interesting. The European Union didn't start out as a kind of political container for the public good. It started out as a kind of market making exercise.
Right.
But then through its kind of growth and maturity, it became a market shaping exercise to manage the pressures of globalization instead of creating them, or neoliberal globalization in this sense. So for those reasons, it preserves some of the things that are very important to Germans and Swedes and Portuguese. It preserves that kind of subsidiarity that the Swedes want a certain kind of social democracy and the Irish want a certain kind of liberal democracy and they want certain kinds of market capitalisms, as long as there's market capitalists and some kind of democratic system. then you're entitled to join that club. And it's a voluntary association. And so some can voluntarily disassociate, as we saw a few years ago. So in those respects, it has the ingredients for something that could be workable in other regions, perhaps not North America, but in other regions, it's something that might allow us to transcend these borders and handle things, particularly these problems that have passports like climate change and, refugees and asylum seekers, et cetera. It may give us that opportunity if we had more of these kind of regional blocks. The danger, of course, is that we do have some regional blocks outside the European Union, and they're not all voluntaristic and committed to democracy in the way the EU has been. So we have the Eurasian Union, headed by hegemon in Russia. They're with like Kazakhstan, so they're not particularly interested in voluntarism and democracy, etc. So there's a danger in those regional blocks as well.
Yeah, so you could have like a multipolar kind of block system that was not necessarily
that might be emerging now. China might be a pole, and etc. So the future will tell.
But the goal, ideally, I mean, we have the UN, right? Could we strive for a global system, something along the EU? Do you think that's ever? I mean, I know in the short term, it doesn't seem very.
Depends on who wins the election today. Right?
Yes.
But one of the real pushbacks we see against the UN and other types of entities like that, I mean, from my perspective, one of the limitations is it is an intergovernmental organization.
Yeah.
And we often think of these international organizations and forget to put the intergovernmental as part of it, is to remember that they're only going to go as far as their members want to go. And that's the nature of these intergovernmental organizations, is that I don't necessarily mean ideologically conservative, that all these government actors are conservative ideologically, but they're conservative in terms of governance. They tend to want to conserve the status quo of like recognizing the national sovereignty of other countries and their ability to handle domestic policy and not interfere with it. That is a kind of conservative mindset that's baked into the United Nations as well. So the UN is going to be necessarily limited because the people that show up there, I mean, a little bit is changing now. Like I think this Brazil COP that's coming up next year might actually be something one hopes a little revolutionary, where they're actually getting a lot more citizen input into this conference of the parties that Brazil is hosting in 2025. We'll see. But traditionally, a lot of the UN mechanisms and governance structures are really, governments talking to governments.
Yeah.
And that necessarily constrains their thinking on problems. They don't want to move outside their lane as a governmental actor. So the UN, I don't know if that's the institution that can really pull this off. And I don't know if we can have a global governance institution yet. Maybe it's not yet conceived of. Maybe it needs to be like the League of Nations, where the UN collapses to make the space for something new.
Yeah. I think maybe it can be,
But the circumstances under which the League of Nations collapses is not what I'd want to repeat. So.
Right. Okay, well, maybe that's a place to leave it on, the specter of global war. But that's been a fascinating conversation.
It's really interesting. Thank you for
very
having
much.
me. I appreciate it very much for sharing some of the ideas. And
we really appreciate it.
If I ever get a podcast going, would you be considered being one of my guests? I don't know if it's going to happen anytime soon.
Of course. Yeah. You got it on record.
Before I turn this off, I do have to kind of just ask one last little question.
Yeah, sure.
Tag on that at the end, which is like self-interest, right? So we're talking about like this. Is it the self-interest of the nation state that's the kind of like the limiting? Like when we were talking about the sort of the inherent conservatism in terms of how member states will act in these intergovernmental fora. Is it is a way of shorthanding that to say self-interest?
National interest, yeah. I mean, self-interest for some, some leaders are so autocratic that when they think national interest, they think personal interest. Like, I would say someone like Vladimir Putin believes the self-interest and national interest in his mind are the same thing. But in general, in more democratic regimes, there's probably a sensibility around the national interest. Like there's whatever you think of Trudeau or Biden or Claudia Sheinbaum in Mexico for personal politics, I believe that each of them think that they're doing what's best for the nation, but it's still privileges their citizens over other citizens. It doesn't treat everybody as equal. It says that I've got a mandate because I was voted in by these people, but I've got a mandate to protect them. And certainly it's not only conservative in that they're a strong sensibility about preserving the national interest. It's also a kind of conservatism around the existing Treaty of Westphalian status quo, that we've kind of landed on this system of political containers around the world, which is everything has taken the shape of a nation state, some of them unnaturally so. You can think of many of the countries of sub-Saharan Africa. The reason the borders are there make no sense, in terms of ethnicity or a sense of kind of political culture. They're just arbitrarily drawn on a map to be, that's Chad, and that's the way it is. But yet, how pervasive that's become for the thinkers, for people, even citizens of Chad, and certainly the government of Chad, is to preserve that kind of political container. It's a kind of way to get and retain power ultimately. And I think that the national interest is as kind of, do good of a kind of thinking that might be, is that I'm concerned about 40 million Canadians. I think somewhere in the back of the minds of even democratically elected leaders, that they perceive that this system that's gotten them into power needs to be retained to keep them in power, even in democracies. So they're not going to unmake that omelet, or bake a different kind of pie, or think really outside the national box, because
they're a product of it.
Yeah, they've got strong incentives to maintain intergovernmental organizations, not legitimate international.
And part of that is not interfering in the sovereignty of others, right? And so it's like, so
lest your own sovereignty is interfered with.
Yeah, right. But it's also like, even the national interest itself, like, who is represented in that national interest might not always, like, it's, even if they're thinking beyond themselves, they're thinking probably more of elites and those with power and that than, your average person on the street. So there's that element as well, I think.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Anyway.
All right. Well, thanks, Conrad. That was great.
Enjoyed it.